This week in Linux, we saw the latest release of the Linux kernel with Linux 6.12. Plus, Qualys announced that they found some security vulnerabilities in the Needrestart package used by Ubuntu. I'll break that down for you and let you know whether you should panic or not. Then we've got a bunch of releases to talk about from Blender, Arch Linux, and more. Then we've got some more news from Mozilla, which is actually positive this time, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Firefox web browser. All of this and so much more on This Week in Linux, the weekly news show that keeps you up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world. Now let's jump right into your source for Linux good news. Linus Torvalds has announced the latest release of the Linux kernel with Linux 6.12. This release comes with a lot of new features and new hardware support. Linux 6.12 is also expected to become the latest LTS release of the kernel, but we don't have any confirmation with that just yet. The process for that takes about a few weeks or so typically. Last time it was like 3.5 weeks and that sort of thing. So it is expected to be an LTS, but we have to wait and see on that. The most notable and exciting new feature for 6.12 has to be that real-time preempt RT support has finally been mainlined. This effort was in the making for 2 decades, basically. The mainline Linux kernel 6.12 is including these, and it's been long awaited for many people. The preempt _RT builds for x86, x86-64, and RISC-V, as well as ARM64 are the ones that are going to be available at the moment. They do plan to add more, but for now, these are the architectures that have support for it. Now, this is great because it finally happened with real-time support in the mainline kernel. This is a big deal because it means that Linux can be used in more critical industrial hardware. For example, like Windows and Mac OS are general-purpose operating systems, and they wouldn't be used in a lot of certain things. And while Linux is used in practically every form of computing, there are some edge cases where Linux didn't work as well. So people needed to use something like specialized hardware with a specialized operating system to get real-time function. Typically, kernels like this would be like ultra-critical, time-sensitive functions that some systems may like focus exclusively on those things and maybe sometimes have multiple purposes or just the single purpose of doing whatever the hardware is supposed to do. Now, example, it would be like NASA and Boeing. They use an OS called VxWorks. And VxWorks is for like NASA Mars rovers to guide them and the Boeing 787 Dreamliner aircraft to control like the avionics system. This is because they need to make sure the commands and signals that they send to the systems can be responsive as quickly as possible to ensure reliability and the planes don't fall out of the sky. Thanks to this change, though, Linux can now be used in all of those machines instead, as long as they are based on the previous architectures, the RISC-V, ARM64, x86, x86-64, and potentially more in the future. The other headline features of this release include support for the ARM permission overlay extension, better compile time control over which Spectre mitigations to use, the deadline server mechanism as a real-time throttling replacement, more development on the EEVDF scheduler, also improvements to the extensible scheduler class, the stabilizing of the device memory TCP work, as well as use of static calls in the security module subsystem, and also the integrity policy enforcement security module to give administrators the ability to restrict execution to only those binaries which come from integrity protected storage, and a lot more. Now, obviously, the real-time kernel work is taking the highlight here, but all of these features are great enhancements to the kernel. And of course, thank you to everyone who contributes to the kernel and basically makes this platform possible, and in turn makes this show possible. So there you go. If you'd like to learn more, links in the show notes. The threat research unit at Qualys identified and reported some flaws recently with the Needrestart package. For those unfamiliar, Needrestart is a utility that scans the system to determine that the services, whether they needed to be restarted after applying shared library updates in a manner that avoids a complete system reboot. This package is used in many distros, but this is not a platform-wide issue as many distros do not use it as well. Ubuntu started using this package in 21.04, so if you're using Ubuntu or something based on Ubuntu, be sure to upgrade to get this patch as soon as possible, because Qualys said The flaws are trivial to exploit. It is believed that these vulnerabilities were introduced in Needrestart 0.8 in April 2014. It's important to note that while these flaws are easily exploited and you need to update as soon as possible, it's not as scary as it sounds. Well, this is a flaw that requires an attacker to already have access to the system before they can exploit it it's a local escalation flaw. So, of course, you should still run updates as soon as possible, but it is not as insane as it sounds. Like a 10-year-long bug that was found, which was not affecting everyone for all those 10 years, but a lot of the times you'll see people talking about on the articles that it's a decade-long bug or something like that. If you have critical systems, though, like an enterprise company or something, that you should probably address this immediately, like now. Though if you are using RHEL or something in the Red Hat family, like Fedora, then you likely won't be affected unless you manually chose to implement it, because they do not ship this utility since DNF has similar functions built in. Now, I'm not trying to downplay this or anything. Most of these flaws have a CVE rating of 7.8 out of 10, so it's pretty high on the severity case. And these Needrestart exploits allow local privilege escalation, or LPE, which means that a local attacker is able to gain root privileges, which is not good, but it is solvable just by running updates. So go do that. Blender 4.3 was released this week for the leading open source 3D modeling software, and there are a lot of new features in this version. First, we'll start with the Linux-specific improvements with Blender 4.3. Blender 4.3 now has an experimental option to use Vulkan to render the user interface. This is early stages of the new Vulkan support, so it might not provide the expected performance improvements just yet, but when it goes to full support, then it will likely be a bigger improvement over OpenGL. The next big thing for Linux users is that Blender 4.3 supports hardware-accelerated ray tracing on Linux using the open source HIP-RT or HIP-RT libraries from AMD. This could provide Linux users with faster render times for scenes or projects that have complex lighting or lots of reflections or a bunch of dynamic shadows if they have an AMD GPU. There's a ton of other features and improvements in Blender 4.3, and there's no way to cover everything. We don't have 45 minutes or more to cover it, and there's also like a lot of, in addition to just being a certain amount, there's also a certain amount of effort and depth that you need to go into each one of those. We don't have time for that, but thankfully, Blender did make a video themselves on their YouTube channel, so I'll link that in the show notes if you want the full in-depth look at what is new. But for now, we'll cover some highlights of this release. So Blender 4.3 is adding multi-pass compositing support to the EEVEE real-time renderer, or just EV, I guess, is how you're supposed to say it. They've added also light and shadow linking in EV, bringing it to a feature parity with cycles. There's also a new brush management system using asset libraries, and they've updated some of the brushes as well as added new brushes and improved performance of brushes overall. There's also a ton of improvements to the grease pencil tool. In fact, they rewrote the whole thing to improve the performance. There's a new layer groups feature in grease pencil. It's also using the new brush asset system. Plus, there's a new tool to edit fill gradients and so much more. I mean, much more in general with Blender 4.3. This is basically just scratching the surface of all the stuff that is in this latest version of Blender 4.3. So if you want to learn more, of course, you'll find links in the show notes. Arch Linux is a distribution that has a reputation for being one of the hardest distros to install. And while it was never really the hardest, times have changed quite a bit. The project Archinstall has effectively changed the landscape of getting started with Arch Linux by making a much more convenient installer for using Arch. So Archinstall makes the process not only easier, but it's also faster. So Archinstall released a new version this week with Archinstall 3.0 that adds even more improvements for the interface because they've overhauled the interface quite a lot. The Arch Linux installer is using the curses library for rendering of the text interface. They have switched it over to using the curses library for rendering to allow for more complex layouts and additional features while keeping a similar look and feel. Archinstall 3.0 also brings various improvements and fixes as well. Now, to be clear, Archinstall does not make Arch Linux beginner friendly. It does make the process much faster than it used to be, but in my opinion, it's far from beginner friendly, very far from beginner friendly. However, it is much more so than it used to be, so there is that. You can now install Arch in under an hour, where it previously would be like a day, maybe, to do it the old-fashioned or previously known Arch way of doing it. So great work to the Archinstall team, but to the few people who still recommend Arch to beginners, stop it. Okay? Stop. Okay, thanks. Bye. This week, I wanted to introduce you to a new way to manage your Flatpak apps. So here is Warehouse. Warehouse is a Flatpak manager app, and it's very featureful. And for those who are using Ubuntu, which doesn't come with a way to manage Flatpaks in a GUI app form, this is a fantastic solution for those users. So here are the main features of Warehouse. So you can view Flatpak info, so Warehouse can display all information provided by the Flatpak list command in a user-friendly graphical way, which is nice. Also, you can change package versions, so it allows you to do rollbacks of any unwanted updates if you need to. You also can manage user data by uninstalling Flatpaks and also deleting user data from it. You can do batch actions, which means that you can do a lot of uninstallations and a lot of user data deletion and that sort of stuff in a batch. You can also have it automatically remove leftover data, which is very nice. And you can also manage remotes. So if you have if you're using the Flat Hub and that's the only thing you're using, then you don't really have to deal with the remotes. But remotes are having the access to be able to get Flatpaks from various different sources. So you, in some systems and some distros, you might have multiple remotes that give you access in this way that you can enable or install or remove remotes if you want to. And they also give you the ability to copy user data to take quick backups before you do anything with your data. So that's really nice. However, there is a little bit of a catch, and that is it doesn't have update functionality for Flatpaks. So OMG Ubuntu reported this about Warehouse, saying that it doesn't check for or notify any available updates to installed Flatpaks, a feature which would especially be useful on Ubuntu since GNOME software does not come pre-installed. That is one of the reasons I would think that Warehouse would be a really good tool for Ubuntu users. There are other, like Linux Mint would have Flatpak support, and anything using KDE Plasma would have Discover more likely, so they would have Flatpak support. But for those who are coming with Ubuntu or in a flavor of Ubuntu that does not have Flatpak out of the box, then this is something that would be cool. So the CLI Flatpak tool also doesn't check for updates without the user prompting it, so you wouldn't get the automatic stuff. But they are working on adding the ability to do updates in Warehouse, which would be very good for the Flatpaks because unless you wanted to install the full GNOME software, you wouldn't really have that as an option. I'm not sure of any other tools that give you this kind of thing anyway right now. So I think a Flatpak manager would be great for people who are using Ubuntu, specifically Ubuntu and the Ubuntu flavors that don't have Flatpak by default and don't have a way to manage them by default, like how Kubuntu would have KDE Discover and etc. In the open source music production space, Ardour has been the go-to DAW or digital audio workstation for years. But there's a new challenger in the ring with Zrythm. This week we saw the first major 1.0 release for Zrythm, and there's a lot to talk about. Zrythm 1.0 features an advanced UI and provides streamlined audio editing capabilities, as well as a variety of tools, many audio mixing features, automatic project backups, and more. I think one of the biggest things, though, is their support for plugins. The Zrythm team says that it supports every major plugin format, including LV2, VST2, VST3, AU, Clap, and JSFX, with additional support for SFZ and SF2 sound fonts, as well as sandboxing thanks to Carla. In my opinion, this is a huge deal because all of the audio professionals I've spoken to about creating on Linux typically comment about the plugin support. So if Zrythm can do all of that, that sounds huge. Something that is interesting to see in a 1.0 release is that they are already planning to change the toolkit that they are using for the interface. They plan to switch it from GTK to Qt 6. To quote the Zrythm developers, they say, GTK, our current GUI toolkit, has not been performing well on non-GNU/Linux platforms. This has been a significant hurdle in achieving the cross-platform compatibility that we've always aimed for with Zrythm. Additionally, we've encountered issues with the Mason build system, which has led us to make some important changes. This is a very interesting situation, but it makes a lot of sense. Technically, GTK does work across platforms, but the support for GTK outside of Linux is iffy at best. A lot of the time, the versions of GTK on Windows and macOS are older than the current versions, which often means developers have to base on older versions to keep things in sync, and that kind of thing is not ideal. Now, Qt is much more consistent across platforms, so it makes a lot of sense for someone who wants to make a cross-platform app to use Qt instead. So Zrythm looks very cool and super interesting, so I'm curious if anyone in the audience is an audio professional or even just a music creation enthusiast. I'm curious what you think of this app. Let me know in the comments. So it's time to celebrate 20 years of Firefox. So Mozilla is announcing that the celebration has started for 20 years of Firefox, and I, as a very long time user of Firefox, I believe 20 years, in fact, and I'm pretty sure I used 1.0. I might have missed 1.0 and started like on 2 or something, but I'm pretty sure I started with the first one. And because I used before that, before it was even called Firefox, there was like 2 or 3 other names before they landed on Firefox. And it's a great browser. It's been a great browser for a very long time. There's a lot of cool features that I use all the time, like container tabs is great. The bookmark features is the best, I think, in terms of all browsers. I don't think any other browser beats the bookmark system in Firefox. I've actually made a video about both of those things, the container tabs, and also why the bookmark system is so good on this channel. So check the links in the show notes for that if you're interested. Now, it's been a little controversial recently for what Mozilla has been doing in many different aspects. There's been some stuff with advertising turned on by default, and there's been things that are questionable. So I understand why people would be a little bit hesitant to celebrate the 20 years right now. But as a long-term Linux user and a long-term Firefox user, I still want to take appreciation the fact that before Firefox, Linux didn't really have much of an option in terms of browsers. And also, even when Firefox came out, it was still quite a while before there was more alternatives. So I'm a fan of Firefox, both historically and now. I still use it as my main browser. It could be improved, and Mozilla could also be improved, but I still want to give them at least credit, because thank you for making this kind of browser when you did. I still think you need to fix the way your current path, but that's a different topic for a different day. So, congratulations to Firefox for 20 years. Let's hope for 20 more. And also improvements to the whole process. If you want to check out the blog post that they made about the 20 years of Firefox, it's really interesting because there's like a history of what happened in 2004. And then also apparently someone did some crop circles of Firefox. I didn't even know that happened ever. So that's interesting, and that's fun, I guess. And also you get a lot more about like the history of like how Firefox has come about and all that sort of thing. So I think that's cool. And I'll have that linked in the show notes for anybody who'd like to learn more. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on this show and want to be kept up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world, then be sure to subscribe. And of course, remember to like that smash button. If you'd like to support the show and the Tux Digital Network, then consider becoming a patron by going to tuxdigital.com/membership, where you can get a bunch of cool perks like access to the patron-only sections of our Discord server and much, much more, including access to the patron-only post show that happens every week after we record this show, as well as a bunch of Destination Linux perks just like that and more. So go to tuxdigital.com/membership to get started and become a patron. You can also support the show by ordering the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt or the This Week in Linux shirt at tuxdigital.com/store. Plus, while you're there, check all the other cool stuff we have like hats, mugs, hoodies, and more at tuxdigital.com/store. I'll see you next time for another episode of your source for Linux news. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell. I hope you're doing swell. Be sure to ring that notification bell. And until next time, I bid you farewell.